Welcome to the Cycling in Alignment podcast, an examination of cycling as a practice and dialogue about the integration of sport and right relationship to your life.
Hello there, cycle nuts. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Cycling in Alignment, episode number 128. How to pedal a bicycle version 3.0. I've covered how to pedal a bike way back in episode number 19 and episode number 30 of the Cycling and Alignment podcast journey. A historical record, an Akashic record of my ramblings. And I've had a lot of people mention to me that they enjoyed those episodes. That said, I have expanded my own knowledge and understanding in this topic and also taught a lot of people a lot of things. One of the most important things when teaching someone how to do something physical is the perfect cueing. That is, balancing the polarities of signal and noise. You can give someone too much information and it makes what you're trying to teach them impossible or impractical or perhaps improbable. So this is an attempt to simplify and condense, but at the same time offer critical information. I've already recorded the bulk of this podcast the other day, walking in the sleet. However, since then, I have edited some magical photos to put on the gram. And if you're a visual type of person, which most people are, I think you'll appreciate this. So I'm going to put about 10 images up on Instagram. And briefly, I'm going to go over them now. We have 5 images of none other than the legendary VDP riding cyclocross. At Cyclocross Worlds, we can clearly see examples of him using the technique of head over foot. So I have the first photo is him seated, head over foot right. Then I have him head over foot left. And then I have 3 standing photos. In the first one, he's over the right. The second one, he's kind of centered and transitioning. And the third, he's over the left foot. So head over foot is one of the basic concepts that I'll talk about in this podcast. And these visual images might help us understand a little bit more about what I mean. One thing I want to disclaim when we're talking about this type of imagery is what I'm doing is taking still shots or photos and I'm just drawing lines on the screen. And what I'm trying to do is use a plumb from the center of the head. And in some of these shots, it may not look like the plumb is completely centered over the head of the athlete. And this is because I'm considering a 3-dimensional view. So if, for example, in number 5, Van der Poel is head over foot left, and I've oriented the line just slightly to the right side of the photograph, to his left. And this is because if his head were angled towards us, not dead center, this is where the line would be present relative to his center line. I hope that's somewhat clear. In any case, I'm probably picking apart nuances that aren't that important. What I want you to do is look at the photos and get the basic idea. In number 6, we have Trek rider Skelmos. I probably just butchered his name. It's been said 942 ways. And he's actually an example of someone who's a bit outside of head over foot, which I don't think is that common. It could be just be the instance of when that photograph was taken. It could also be that movement is stochastic and imperfect, and that's okay. We don't expect someone to adhere to all these principles all the time. And at this point in the race, he was probably fatigued, glycogen depleted, dehydrated to some degree. We can tell because it's late in the race and there's shrapnel all over the course. So take that for what it is. In the 7th image, I have 2 Trek riders. There's one in front and there's one following. I believe the following rider is Tom's Squinch, and he's doing an excellent job of showing us head over foot. The rider in front of him is not. So these are 2 contrasting views that we can see. And I'm not here to pick on anybody or tell you that somebody's riding their bike wrong. These are all some of the world's best athletes. However, in a future pod, I will point out some biomechanical, in my opinion, errors that some riders are making, and I'll talk about those. And I'll put on some gloves and take a few swings at people, not in a mean way, not in a provocative way. I'm just going to call it like I see it. And I might stab some sacred cows in the eyeballs. So just be aware that might be a thing that happens. In image number 8, we have 2 women sprinting for the line. And these are good examples of head over foot. Although our SD Works rider who's in second position isn't quite there. Now, it could be that she's transitioning over. So keep in mind what we're looking for is someone who's using head over foot at or near the end of the power phase is when we would expect that to happen. Vanderpool has head over foot right at 3 o'clock, between 3 and 4 o'clock, which is really interesting. Some riders will have head over foot later in the stroke. What does that tell us about where their optimal power band is? I don't know the answer to that question. Is it optimal or suboptimal? I mean, we know VDP kicks ass, so we can take that as a given, but we also have to understand that just because someone is winning races at the world level doesn't mean their biomechanics are optimized. It doesn't mean their movement patterns are optimized. This is a fallacy. It's a mistaken belief, and I see it all the time. Well, the pros do it this way, so I should do it this way. And pro riders are not necessarily people we should emulate. Often they are people who are just ridiculously talented and they're leveraging their talent to get results or win races. But it doesn't mean everything's optimized. This is a huge misbelief about professional sports. It's quite a gap between optimal human performance and biomechanics and winning races at the highest level or succeeding at the highest level in any sport. We can find examples of people who are biomechanically working very well in our little universe of joints, muscles, fascia, and tendons. And we can find people that are total train wrecks and still manage to win bike races or do other things. So our task is to discern the difference and work towards optimization of movement, independent of those paradigms. We're merely using these people as examples. And I don't mean to be judgy or elitist or any of that crap. So image number 9 and 10 are of Kopecky and Longo Borghini coming to the line at Strada. And in image number 9, we can see Kopecky. That's a good example of transition. She's leading there and she's in between strokes. And we can tell this because the cranks are not quite horizontal, but pretty close. And she's going from one side to the other. So she's just come from left head over foot. She's transitioning to right. And the bike is leaning. One of the things I mentioned in the pod is that narrow handlebars can kind of sometimes screw up head over foot because the levers aren't quite adjusted right. Then in image number 10, we see a great example of both riders doing pretty much perfect head over foot. And if you just look at them for a moment, you'll see what I mean. There's a dead ass shot pretty much of Longo Borghini. This is just seconds either before or after the number 9 shot. I don't know which. And she's dead head over foot on the left side. And her bike is almost square to the camera. So it's a nice shot. It's a nice example of someone who's got a very tidy head over foot. And she's dead in the power phase there. Whereas Kopecky's transitioning in number 9 with cranks close to horizontal. She's still moving over. So there's a very organic flow, and there's also individualization of this technique. Where in the power phase does someone actually go head over foot? Probably depends on many factors. It may depend on the gear, the cadence, the torque. Cadence and torque, of course, being reciprocal or inversely related to each other. It may be related to the gradient of road or even the road surface. Right? Those change how we pedal. We learned that a million years ago with the studies that Jeff Broker did at USA Cycling about pedal stroke technique. Everybody was so excited about those, and a lot of people called it wrong. They thought that the trackies would have the best pedal strokes, when in fact the mountain bikers had the best pedal strokes. Why? Because mountain bikers have to have a smoother distribution of power over the power phase so they don't spin their wheel on loose terrain. When they're riding up steep climbs, you have to have a more even power distribution over the power phase. And then in number 10, we see Kopecky leading in the front, and she's dead over on the right. She's got a nice head over foot there. That's pretty clear. So hopefully these visuals help illustrate that one aspect. I obviously talk about other ways that we need to focus on pedaling a bike, but head over foot is a really important one, especially out of the saddle, but it also applies in the saddle. So please note photos 1 and 2 of VDP riding at Worlds, obliterating the competition and dropping watt bombs everywhere and clearly using head over foot as he's in the saddle. This is essential. So the harder the rider goes, the more torque is applied, the more head over foot will be needed and necessary. And remember, I'm not sure I quite made this point effectively in the main body of my yammering. We don't pedal bikes with legs. This is also a massive misconception. The harder you pedal, the more you use your entire body. So you pedal your bike with your entire body. So think about this for a minute. If you've ever gone on a 5 or 6 or 7 hour ride and just emptied the tank, when you really, really exhaust your system, every muscle hurts. Your arms hurt, your lats hurt, your lungs hurt, your intercostals hurt, your neck hurts, shoulders hurt. Everything is sore the next day, everything. That's because you use your whole body to pedal a bike. So I encourage you to stop thinking about legs all the time. I want you to think about how your entire body impacts your pedaling and the fascial system that is used to drive the bike from top down and from bottom up. It's one continuous line of force. And when you think that way, you can use an elastic strategy to drive the bike on steep terrain, especially during high torque moments. That's all I got for the intro. Enjoy this podcast. If you have questions or comments, please hit me back. Thank you so much for listening. Ciao. Hello there, Cycling in Alignment listeners, audience members. Today, I'm going to revisit a past topic, how to pedal a bike. We'll call it 2.0 or discussion expansion or further thoughts on pedaling a bike, something like that. And I'm walking as I record this podcast. Like so many of my days, today was filled with choices. Do one activity or another, and another. And for me to walk and record at the same time is helpful. Walking helps me compile my thoughts. It also keeps me connected to my body and my breathing rhythms, in addition to accessing my logical left brain. And it gets me a little bit of movement while I'm recording. So hopefully you won't hear too many background noises. I am currently being snowed on, or I guess it's closer to sleet. It's a wintry day in March of Colorado. But before I begin to unpack my thoughts on pedaling a bike, my further thoughts, I want to take a moment to express some gratitude for those members of my audience who have chosen to contribute to my podcast financially. I am so grateful that you find my work valuable, and this is what drives me to keep doing it. So thank you very much for making a contribution and supporting the pod. I'm sure you can figure out that running a podcast is expensive and time consuming. And ultimately, I've come to the point where I have to find a way to fund my podcast. Last year, I had the support of Enduro Bearings, which make excellent products. I highly encourage you to go patronize their site whenever you feel it's appropriate and you need amazing bearings for your new whip or your old whip, especially if you want a bottom bracket with a lifetime guarantee. I will be eternally grateful to Enduro for their support. However, they are no longer supporting the pod in 2024. And so I've chosen to self-fund simply by asking my audience, if you feel that my podcast has contributed to your well-being in some way, please demonstrate this through a simple act. And to do that, you can go to my website, colbypierce.com, and click on the podcast page, and you'll see details on how to do that. They're all different options. So thank you so much to the audience members who have chosen to contribute. I'm very grateful for not only for your financial contribution, but also for your vote of confidence in me and your expression that my work has value to you. That is really important to me, because I don't want to just be here talking into a hall of mirrors. That's lame. Okay, onward. How to pedal a bike 2.0. So I'll start with a very brief recap of my basic concepts in my first 2 episodes about how to pedal a bike, which were published a long time ago. I don't even know when. I think these episodes were in the teens maybe, or the 20s of the first round of Cycling in Alignment, when I was back working with Fast Talk Labs. And I went into some pretty good detail about the why. And in this episode, I really want to focus more on the how. I understand that some people want to know the why, and I unpacked a lot of that in those 2 episodes. I think they were around 17 and 18, if I remember correctly. I'm not looking at the list right now, obviously, because I'm tromping around in a neighborhood. But if you want to go back and hear more about the why, that is to say, how I developed my philosophy of pedaling a bike. That's what I mean when I really say the why, I guess. Today, we're going to focus more on the how. And I'm going to break it down into 2 different major chapters. Chapter 1 will be standing cycling. Sorry, got that backwards already. Chapter 1 will be seated cycling, because that's what we do most of the time. And chapter 2 will be standing cycling. And this was one of the realizations I had after doing the first 2 episodes, was I was really thinking mostly of seated cycling. And there are some non-trivial differences between the 2, no doubt. So I'm going to break them into 2 different chapters. And chapter 1 on seated cycling really has 4 major points. How to pedal a bike. Now, I'll preamble this by saying that if your bike fit isn't right, it's going to be really hard to execute these basic concepts. And by bike fit, what I mean is saddle height, crank length, cleat position, foot to shoe interface, which may or may not involve an orthotic or orthosis. Cleat angle is included in cleat position, but also cleat fore aft. And then we have, of course, saddle position, height, setback, nose, angle. That's nose angle. That was one concept. And saddle shape will influence your ability to execute a proper pedal stroke. Why? Well, for example, if the saddle material is way too bouncy, which is something I commonly see, then you won't be able to pedal smoothly, which is one of the objectives of pedaling. As a quick case study, a lot of the 3D printed saddles, which everybody or a lot of people seem to really be drawn to because it's a new neato technology, they're really bouncy and really padded. The Specialized Mirror is one example. Physique makes one as well. And I have rarely found these to be final solutions for my clients. We don't want a lot of bouncy material, or we don't want a top cover or a fabric or a padding that allows a lot of bounce or encourages a lot of bounce in pedal stroke. Because when you are applying a lot of power to the pedals, we need stability. We need a little bit of guidance for that pelvis, right? Not in all planes, but in most planes. So, okay, point 1 about seated cycling. Pretty simple. And this one might shock a lot of people. When you're seated on the bike, I want you to pedal like you're riding on a flat pedal. Meaning, I want you to pedal as though you were pedaling on flat mountain bike pedals. Not beach cruiser pedals, mountain bike pedals. There's a slight difference. Mountain bike pedals have little spiky bits that are the things that destroy your shins when you fall off and scrape your pedal against the shin, right? These are little set screw type devices, depending on the exact model of pedal. Ooh, leaf blower, my favorite. So when we're seated, we want to focus on the power phase of the pedal stroke. We can define this as the front half of the stroke. So if we're looking at the bike from the drive side, which would be pretty typical, most people tend to orient themselves towards the drive side of the bike. We would understand the power phase to be from 12 to 6. From when the crank is vertical to when the crank is vertical. Meaning pointing up to pointing down. Vertical at the top versus vertical at the bottom. Hopefully that's clear. And at 3 o'clock, the crank would be horizontal, pointing forward towards the front hub. That would be the power phase on the right leg. And the mirror image of that would be the power phase on the left leg. But if you put a clock face on it, it would be going backwards from 12 to 11 to 10 to 9 would be horizontal, etc. down to 6. And so when you have a mountain bike flat pedal with grip on it, we don't just stomp on the pedal at 3 o'clock. We take advantage of every microsecond, every degree of action that we have during the power phase of potential force we can apply to the pedal. And so we do that by pushing at 12 o'clock forward. And then as soon as we're past 12 o'clock, like 12:15, we are beginning to push down in addition to pushing forward. And at 3 o'clock, we're pushing mostly down. And then at 4, 5, and 6, we're still pushing down realistically and perhaps starting to pull slightly back. And at 6 o'clock, we could argue that we want to pull back, not up. However, I will caution the user here that we do not want to pull up during any phase of seated cycling. This is a myth. One of my former podcasts was titled something like 99 Italian Wives' Tales About Bike Fitting, most of which needs to be assassinated. One of them is sliding forward to the nose of the saddle is good. Another one is ride with your knees close to the top tube. This one needs to die with a howitzer. And another one, perhaps the biggest one of all, is that we should pull up on the backside of the stroke. This is completely incorrect. Do not do this. There are multiple reasons why. I unpacked some of them in my previous podcasts. If you want to go dig into them, please do. But I'll just give you the 3 cliff notes right away. 1, you don't gain any efficiency. 2, you do it at the expense of your greatest strength, which is your ability to push down, which is what humans are meant to do. And 3, the chances are that if you do it, you're going to hyperfacilitate the psoas, which is not a phasic muscle. It's a tonic muscle, and we don't want to do this. All it does is screw up your pelvis and trash the alignment of your pelvis and your ribcage and cause a muscle that really wasn't meant to do repetitive, forceful action to do it. The psoas is primarily a postural muscle. It's not a moving muscle. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, we can pull back at 6 o'clock, but in theory at 6, we should be done. So you're only pedaling with the first half of the circle, or for the first half of the circle with each leg, and 2 halves make a whole. This is how we make smooth pedaling. How we really make smooth pedaling is not to stab the pedal at 3 o'clock or axe chop it, but to smooth on either end. But the end you should focus on most is the first part of the power phase, from 12 to 3. This is correct. And we can drive with a lot of force there, especially during seated climbing. Now, if you're trying to feel this, the best way to feel it is actually during seated climbing. Lower cadences, higher torque. We tend to feel things at lower speed better, especially if we're learning how to do them. So if you've never focused on this part of the pedal stroke, I invite you to try it. Now, in order to do this effectively, you're going to have a flat or nearly flat foot. If you go into the power phase where the crank comes vertical at 12 o'clock with a pointed toe, you're not going to have a very good leverage angle to drive forward and down. But at 3 o'clock, almost everyone's foot is flat because you're driving straight down, and you do that with a flat foot. So if you come into the power phase at 12 with a pointed toe, that is, the foot is pointed down, the toe is pointed down, and the heel is up like a ballerina, then you have to wait pretty much all the way until 3 for that foot to flatten out, which means you've torched the first half of your power phase, 50% of your power phase, which is precious. The power phase is a precious resource. It is what you use to drive the bike. And there's at least one study out there to support the idea that really the big difference in how pros deliver force versus amateurs is pros push down harder. It's not they pedal that much smoother. They probably do in many cases, but they just push harder with more force. So we don't want to give up that downforce. So this is where advice like pedaling circles can be a bit misleading. I would argue that we want to pedal half circles. That is, one half of a circle with a left leg and one half of a circle with a right leg, which together makes a complete circle. So you could say that the advice to pedal circles is complete and accurate, or even correct, with that small qualifier. We're not pedaling a complete circle with the left leg and a complete circle with the right leg. My philosophy is completely ignore the leg on the backside of the stroke. Let the forward leg do the work. Not everyone agrees with this. Full disclaimer. That's my take on it, based on all the things I got. Okay, point 2 about seated cycling. How to pedal a bike while seated. Focus on axial extension of the spine. What does this mean, Colby? It means, young Padawan, that you must make the distance from your pelvic floor to the crown of your head as long as possible. You must extend your spine to be tall. Another way to think about this would be if I balanced a teacup full of hot tea on your head and asked you to walk across the room like a cruel martial arts master and not burn yourself. You would walk with an upright, extended spine, and you would walk, well, like a ninja. Very quietly, without a lot of jerky motion. But the jerky motion is incidental. What's important is the upright spine and the level head. Now, it's not that I want your head level. I don't mean level with the horizon. I mean extended away from your pelvic floor. So when you're on a bike and you're hinged forward at the hip, we want your head to go as far away from your pelvis as possible. Why is this important? This is critical because when you breathe, your diaphragm moves vertically. It's like an elevator moving up and down along the path of your spine. And if you fold over at the diaphragm, which would be right around typically your lower rib cage. So let's do a little self-exploration here. Poke yourself right in the solar plexus or the sternum. And then take your finger down from there and find the bottom of your rib cage and trace it around to the sides of your torso. Now trace the lower ribs around the backside of your torso. So that lower rib line, that's where your diaphragm is. The diaphragm is a divider between the upper torso and the lower torso. Below it are where most of your viscera lie, and above it is where your lungs and heart lie. And when you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and pushes down on your viscera. Viscera is just a sciencey way to say guts. And so if you fold in half, right around that point of the lower ribs, which is quite common in cycling, then your diaphragm cannot move up and down. You are folded over it. And the only way for you to breathe is to inflate the chest or maybe the posterior ribs. If some people do this well, some don't. But we want to inflate the entire rib cage. And really, when we're doing a hard effort, what we want is a 360-degree increase in circumference of the line we drew around those lower ribs. On a big inhale, that's what we want during riding. We want all the ribs to expand in that circle, starting at the bottom ribs and working up to the ribs all the way by the collarbone, the first rib. That is the goal of functional respiration while cycling. And this is best done with a straight spine rather than a bent spine or a flexed spine. Flexion is when you move towards the fetal position. So flexion would be touching your toes. Make sense? So when we're riding, we want to recognize a certain posture that's optimal for being on the bike. And this posture is having axial extension of the spine or working towards axial extension of the spine. This allows expansion of, we'll call it the lower rib circumference. From lower rib circumference, expansion follows the subsequent ribs above. Then we get a full capacity for inhalation and exhalation. And there's some physiologists who will argue that there's no mechanical restriction to breathing. That's not the rate limiting factor in exercise. And this is incorrect. Rate limiting factors can happen all over the place in people. It depends on the individual. So thinking this way it drives me a bit insane. Science continually underestimates the bioindividuality of the human body, in my opinion. We must not do this. This is incorrect. So when we sit on the bike with axial extension of the spine, we also find that we can depress and retract slightly the shoulders. What does that mean, Colby? I use this term cautiously because it can be overused. But depress and retract just means pull your shoulders down and back. That's what that means. This is nice. I got the trail all to myself because it's snowing. I'm going to snap a photo for you guys. This will be our photo for the magical Instagram drop. Look at that trail. Cool. So, as we're sitting with axial extension of the spine, we can pull our shoulders slightly down and back and externally rotate our shoulders. And this puts a slight tension in the lats. The lats are really big muscles that basically run from the backside of your shoulders diagonally to your spine and all the way down to the top of the hip. So they're like these huge bat wings, right? So for those of you who ever saw Wile E. Coyote, super genius. He makes this flying batsuit thing because he's trying to always outsmart the Roadrunner and eat him. Wile E. Coyote is perpetually this critter who makes these devices, and inevitably they fail. He blows himself up or falls off a cliff or whatever. So he makes this amazing batsuit, and this is what the lats are. I'll see if I can find a screenshot of Wile E. Coyote. Super genius. In fact, I think I'll just call the podcast Wile E. Coyote Super Genius, because that's fun to say. Like Mojo Dojo Casa House. And so we understand that the lats are connected to the hips and the shoulders. So the lats are the bridge in the posterior oblique chain. So if you listen to my podcast with spiral patterns or about spiral patterns and you said, this is me, like many of my readers did, because it's quite common, my readers, my audio readers, my mind movie listeners, then what you discovered is you have a less than optimal relationship in your posterior oblique sling, most likely. That is, if you're dropping the right hip, you probably have instability in the left shoulder. They are almost always coupled, right? That's interesting. You're thinking, I didn't know that. Maybe you're not thinking that. Maybe you already know that. Probably some of you are. And so when we have this lack of optimal tension, lack of fascial tension between one shoulder and the opposite hip or the contralateral hip, then that facilitates the spiral. We have a dominance of one sling over the other. You can call this a sling system or an oblique chain, oblique sling system. These terms are somewhat interchangeable. So when we gently feel the shoulders down and back, we're turning on the lats, especially when we externally rotate the shoulders. Now, externally rotate means while you're holding the bar, I want you to twist your hand slightly and emphasize the outside of the hand. That's the side by the pinky finger. As though you were going to stick your thumb up and go hitchhiking. This would be external rotation, or give someone a thumbs up. I don't recommend hitchhiking. Not in 2024. It probably used to be a thing you could do. I wouldn't do it now. So, it's like proper winter out. I'm hiking into a cloud here. So, if I'm a little sniffly, that's why. It's pretty chilly out. So, when we ride with axial extension and we gently pull the shoulders down and back, and when I say gently, I mean like a 2 out of 10 or a 1 out of 10. I would use the word feel the shoulders pulling back rather than pull. This is important. It's easy to over-index on this type of stuff. This is a gentle sensation because it's a postural cue. Then we begin to turn on the deep muscles of the inner unit. We have a tension on the pelvic floor, a tension on multifidi, a tension on the lats, which is not part of the inner unit, but is relevant. And we begin to connect the two contralateral posterior oblique slings. And this begins to give you the power to actualize both global stability and tensegrity in the system. Tensegrity, remember, is just the combination of tension and integrity in the system, or really fascial tension. That's what it is fundamentally. And it is crucial for all athletic performance, not just cycling. You watch all the best in the world and they're all doing it. And then it gets us to point 3, which is simply head over foot. Now, what is the concept of head over foot? I'll describe this, and fear not if you're not quite following, because I will put some photos on the Instagram that you can see. This will require a bit of visual explanation. Head over foot is, well, it's really actually just what it sounds like. As I'm hiking right now, and I step with my left leg, my nose is directly aligned over that toe. And then I step with my right leg, and my nose is directly aligned over that toe. So there is a rhythmic lateral movement, which isn't really just lateral, but we might describe it as lateral movement of the torso, not of the head. I'm not moving my neck. My neck is quiet. My neck stays in line with my torso. And this head over foot motion helps us drive the bike. It also helps us align properly when we're running and walking. So what is the opposite of head over foot? You might be wondering. There are probably 3 trains of thought. Here, one is probably, okay, cool. Head over foot, got it. Another is, no, I thought we were supposed to have a stable, strong core. And therefore, when we're moving our torso over our foot, we're being sloppy or we're wasting energy. This is incorrect. And the third line is something in between, which is like, well, I don't really understand what you're talking about, but I'm willing to try it. Or I'm skeptical. So if you want to learn more about head over foot, the best reference I can point you to is David Weck. Go to the Weck method on Instagram and check out some of his kooky ideas. He's got a lot of brilliant stuff on there. Maybe someday I can get him on the pod. That would be baller. I don't know if I'm quite that cool yet, but Dave seems like a pretty chill guy, so maybe. But the idea is when you look at a rider from the front, there will be some head over foot. Now, there are certain conditions in which head over foot applies a lot more than others. Head over foot applies mostly as intensity goes up, and also as torque goes up, and even more so when cadence goes down. It's hard to have a lot of head over foot during a high cadence moment. When I say high cadence, I mean more than 110 RPM, although it is possible. Just this morning, I was watching an old video of Chris Hoy doing a kilo at, I think it was Manchester 2002 Worlds, something like that. Maybe it was a World Cup. I don't know. I don't recall what event it was. And even at top speed, he was doing well over 100 RPM, probably closer to 110 or 120, somewhere in that range. And we were getting plenty of head over foot. Once you look for it, you can see it immediately. The best way to spot it is from a front view, because then you can see when the head goes over the foot on each pedal stroke. So during the power phase of the stroke, your nose should be aligned over the second and third toe. And by the way, your knee should be in that line too. And your hip, more or less. So head over foot is crucial. And it's especially crucial when we're talking about torque efforts or steep climbs. So the more torque we have to generate and the higher the intensity, the more we want to use head over foot to our advantage. What head over foot means is we're spreading the load of pedaling over the entire fascial system. We want to move away from using a single muscle group, like your quads, to drive the bike. If you are riding really hard and every time you ride super hard, your quads are completely smoked and nothing else hurts that much, that tells us that you're either way too quad dominant which is the most likely explanation. Or maybe it tells us that you're simply too rigid on the bike. A really good example of someone who was super rigid and had almost no head over foot was Levi. Another example, which I've used as an example of souplesse perfection, is Gianni Bugno. That guy was like motionless, right? Vasily Kirienka, another example, extremely motionless. It's very rare that a cyclist can actually perform this type of cycling and not have severe rate limiting factors. And I will tell you point blank and honestly that I have fallen victim to this error in my own career on more than one occasion, and it has caused me to blow up. It's a moment where the preconceived idea of how you should ride or a mental image of your form overtakes the need to go fast. And this is something that my young sparring partner, Jonathan Vauders, used to master very well. Jonathan was a very elastic rider. He had a very elastic strategy when he was younger. Kind of bouncy almost. He really rocked his bike. He rocked his body over the bike during seated cycling. And he was able to put a lot of leverage into the pedals. And he was famous for getting on the massage table and not having a lot of knots in his muscles. And I think one of the explanations for this is that, first of all, Jonathan's personality was very flaccid. He was very chill. I mean, he had his uptight moments for sure, but whenever he had those moments, he was really good at releasing them. And there's unquestionably a relationship between fascial and muscular tension and your personality, right? How uptight you are about the world. There's a reason why people use the term anal retentive. So when you're flexible, when you're loose, you can apply force in a way that's more like water than wood, right? So, yes, Jonathan, I just used the word flaccid to describe your personality. Just gonna have to deal with that, buddy. So that's the concept of head over foot. Now, during lighter efforts, less intensity, higher cadence, we want to need less head over foot. And we also want to use a bit of caution when I describe head over foot and explain clearly that head over foot is about organized movement. It's not flailing randomly. And also the head is not disconnected from the torso. One telltale sign that someone doesn't have good head over foot or really good inner unit or deep core control is they do have shoulder and torso movement, but at the end of the power phase, the chin moves away. It dips away. It's like the head nods. So if your ears are tilting a lot, not in coordination with your shoulders or your torso, that's a sign that your head over foot is out of control. And your deep core is not quite functioning the way it ought to. So you can see this in a lot of riders. See if I can find some video of Tommy Vogler, a good example of someone who had disastrous inner unit control, but still managed to be a pretty good pro in his own way. Okay, number 4, the rotary model. So here's also a concept that goes into the 99 Italian wives' tales about bike fitting, most of which need to be assassinated category. And the concept is that all movement is rotary. We like to think in cycling that our legs are like sewing machines, ideally, and they just go in that perfect circle. And when we look at a rider from behind or from the front, that their leg moves in this perfectly vertical path, right? That is a crisp sagittal plane, power-driven movement. And this is incorrect. All movement is rotary. Humans move in spirals. Human movement is spiral in nature, especially when it's under load. It has to be by definition. To understand why this is, look at the muscular distribution of fibers and fascial compartments, or what you might call individual muscles in the leg. And note that they travel in a spiral pattern. The obvious example being sartorius. So when we consider this, we understand that rotary movement means ideally that there is a heel strike in gait. This is the old school model of gait I'm talking about. the loading of the midfoot, and then the push-off phase, which involves pronation and dorsiflexion of the toe and the windlass mechanism of the foot, which tensions and engages the arch. And I'm here to offer you an application of a slightly alternative model. Keep in mind, though, first of all, that model of gait is rotary, right? The foot is rotating in multiple planes as this happens. It is rotating in the frontal plane, or everting and inverting. It is also rotating in the transverse plane, as well as the sagittal plane. Sagittal plane would be dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. That's pointing your toes and lifting your toes up towards your shin. Sorry. Everting and inverting is, let's see, how do I describe this? Well, it'd be like your traditional wedging systems in bike fitting, right? Everting, putting the foot so that the big toe is higher than the pinky toe, and inverting the opposite. The pinky toe would be above the first toe, the big toe. Those are your two contrasts there. And then transverse plane would be just rotating the heel in and out away from the crankset, right? So, did I get that right? Yeah, I think that's right. So, when we're thinking about a rotary model, we're taking into account that during not only walking and running, but pedaling, and pedaling is, in my opinion, by definition, a subset of gait. Not everyone agrees with me on that, but it has to be, in my opinion. There's no way around it. Yes, it's a learned activity, but it layers a motor program on top of the most fundamental motor program there is, which is gait. The question is, how disrupted is that motor program, and what interference patterns do we get? That is the question, because all energy is waves, and a motor program is nothing more than energy or intent. And by Wolff's Law, it is a program that has been grooved into our nervous system. Wolff's Law states that basically the more you do something, the more embedded it becomes, the more entrained that nervous system response becomes. Or not nervous system response, that's the wrong way to think about it. Movement pattern, movement engram. So I'm going down now. Got to get back for a phone call. So if you hear more foot strikes and less ninja, that's why. Also, it's properly icy out. Or really slushy. And so we are talking about this rotary movement. And what I would offer is, when we are driving over the top of the power phase of the stroke, we want to drive with the fifth metatarsal as our focus. What does that mean, Colby? The fifth metatarsal is your pinky toe. The first metatarsal is your big toe. So we have our big toe, second toe, third toe, fourth toe, and pinky toe, fifth toe. And the metatarsals are just the joints where the ball of the toes are. So the first metatarsal would be the ball of the first toe, right? The ball of the foot is as commonly referred to. So when you are driving over this power phase, we want to think about that fifth metatarsal, under the surface under the fifth metatarsal as your driving point. And we think of this as almost a pivot point. It's where during gait, when we're walking with, we'll say, this archetype of movement enabled, we're pivoting off the fifth metatarsal. So we're emphasizing the lateral edge of the foot, the bony edge of the foot, the bony arch, the outside of the foot away from the side of the foot, away from the crankset. And this is definitely contrary to how some people pedal. But there's distinct advantages to this. Now, full disclaimer, this isn't my idea. It's sort of a refinement of a thing I've been thinking about for a while, but this crystallizes it. So this comes from a movement system I've been telling some of my clients about recently. It's called GOATA. That's GOATA, which stands for, it's an acronym, Greatest of All Time Athletes. And I'm currently studying this quite a bit more. And the more I study it, the more I'm on board with how it interacts with cycling and gives us useful cues on how to pedal. And fear not, young warriors, I've been applying this to my athletes in the Fit Studio and also with myself. And I would never offer anything to you without testing it, at least of the N of 1, which is the ultimate laboratory, in spite of what any scientist will tell you. In fact, I would argue it's the only relevant laboratory. Now, there's a controversial statement, as long as we're stabbing sacred cows right in the face, so to speak. The only relevant laboratory is your personal laboratory. It's like that old cartoon with Dexter, my laboratory. So actually better analogy is my beat laboratory, right? So don't touch my drum set. And so when we're talking about the N of 1 laboratory and GOTA, what we mean is to use the surface on the underside of the foot, under the pinky toe, as our pivot point. What does that mean? It means that we pivot off of it in the rotary motion. So as the foot strikes the ground, we would have our weight on the outside of the foot, the outside of the heel, and then the outside lateral edge of the foot. And then it would hit the fifth metatarsal. And at that point, we would begin to rotate the foot so the heel comes out. And we drive off before pronation happens. And when we do this, the advantage is, one, we turn on gluteus medius and other external hip rotators, including glute max, during the power phase, which is one of the most common sources of dysfunctional movement patterns and power generation we see, is what's called a medial rotational instability, or an MRI, where the kneecap points inwards and the femur is rotated internally during pedaling. Why do I care, Pierce? Stop talking about anatomy and tell me what the fuck is going on. What I mean is, when you pedal and your knees collapse in and hit the top tube, this leaks power. It does not deliver the full force of your glutes into the pedal, which we absolutely want. It brings you into quad dominance. It causes multiple problems in the pelvis and lower back. It usually facilitates a spiral pattern, and it rubs the pain off your top tube. No, it probably does that, actually. There are a lot of riders who have that, but I don't really care about that. It also puts undue stress on the IT bands. Think about it. If you think of your hips, knees, and ankles as a 3-joint system, and you push the knees in towards each other, does that make the IT band longer or shorter? It makes it longer. And this is one of the problems with self-administered stretching protocols, is people experience on the bike, ow, my IT bands hurt a lot. Or they get on the massage table and the massage therapist rubs their legs and they go, ooh, your IT bands are really tight. Well, if you have a medial rotational instability because you've got excessive pronation, that is, your foot dives in towards the midline, your arch collapses towards the midline, and your knee dives in towards the top tube, and you have internal rotation of the femur, well, that's probably going to pull your IT band really long, which causes the tissue to say, ouch. Now, what's the worst thing you can do with an IT band that's already been stretched too long on thousands or tens of thousands of pedal strokes on every bike ride? Go and stretch it more. See the problem? We are becoming further off target. So we have to have a basic understanding of our own symptoms, or that's not the right word. We have to have a basic understanding of how we exhibit what we are doing currently before we can apply a solution or an intended effect. Because if we don't have an understanding of that and we blindly apply stretching to things that hurt, then we may be actually making the problem worse. Because if we stretch an IT band, and assuming we actually did move the tissue in some way, which is debatable, but if we lengthen the tissue, then we would encourage the knee. We're building instability in the IT band. And that allows the knee to go further in towards the top tube, which exacerbates all of our problems. Right? And this is the cause of the ACL tear in soccer. It's medial rotational instability. So this is a pattern that is repeated in many sports. This is also the origin of GOTA's philosophy on inside ankle bone high, which is the equivalent of saying, or not the equivalent, but closely related to the practice of using the fifth metatarsal, the underside of the fifth metatarsal, as a pivot point and having weight be distributed on the outside. But what that does, if you play with this right now, you push your inside ankle bone high and put your weight on the outside of your foot. Notice how your arch domes. So what we need is an active, stable arch. And that active, stable arch is what drives proper mechanics up the chain or allows proper power to be driven into the pedal. Now, here's a super, super critical point, which is central to my entire fitting philosophy, which is this domed arch must be intrinsic, not extrinsically created. by an orthosis or an orthotic or an arch or a wedge or a series of wedges and orthotics. When we post the foot with a bunch of mechanical devices, we are not creating intrinsic strength, we're creating extrinsic crutches. And what we do is we further exacerbate the problems. We weaken the body even more by creating instability at the ankle. And maybe the ankle is moderately stable, but the hips and the force driven from above is quite high because you've trained a lot. And it's the delta between these systems that causes the problem. You've got a pretty strong hip, maybe only in one plane or maybe not even in a functional plane, but you've got a strong hip. And then you have a strong knee. That is to say, really I'm speaking in metaphor a bit because you don't have strong hips and knees. Those are joints. You can, but really we're talking about muscles. So glutes, quads, hams, calves. And these things are strong, but we don't have a strong ankle. We don't have a strong tibialis anterior. We don't have a strong structure to the dome of our foot. And then that power gets obliterated in movement, right? Friction between the shoe and the foot. Or it stresses tissue. And then you get injured. These are possible consequences. Hi. And so this is why I would suggest that when you're driving during seated cycling, you're you are feeling the force under the fifth metatarsal. Now, I will say that there could be possible exceptions to this, and one might be that if you are an extreme supinator, GOTA offers that everyone will benefit from this program. Full disclaimer, I haven't tried this with anyone who's a really big supinator yet. And it could be that it moves your movement pattern a little bit to the suboptimal situation. If you're already a supinator, how do you know if you're a supinator? You have very high arches. You wear out the outsides of your feet. Your knees are slightly bowed. You maybe have been described as bow-legged in the past. And that's how you tackle most types of situations. You grew up riding horseback. You're probably a supinator if you ride a lot of horses, because riding horses will reinforce a pattern of supination or supination. Always have the emphasis on the correct syllable. Okay? So, a review of our concepts. 1, ride like you're on a flat pedal. Don't pull up. Smooth the ends of the stroke. That is, drive forward over the top and a little bit back through the bottom. Then let it go, because if you're on a flat pedal and you tried to pull up, your foot would come off. That's why that's a beautiful, simple commandment or suggestion. 2, ride with axial extension of the spine. Feel the shoulders being pulled gently down and back. Feel breath into the 360-degree rib circle, the lower rib cage. Feel the expansion and contraction of those ribs on each breath. Believe it or not, breathing is intimately related to pedaling. 3, head over foot. Head over foot goes up. The harder you pedal and the bigger gear you're in, right? As torque increases, head over foot goes up. That means you can actually see people's heads bobbing. And if you want to watch this, now that you're looking for it, go look at Vanderpool in, any cyclocross race this season. You can clearly see him exercising head over foot. Hold on, brief pause while I negotiate muddy rocks. Very good. Currently descending what is known as the goat path. And it actually is pretty much a goat path. 4, rotary model. Inside ankle bone high. A slight external rotation of the femurs. And driving under the fifth metatarsal. What does that mean in English? That means inside ankle bone high. Well, that part's English. But non-anatomical English, external rotation of the femurs. Imagine you had 2 headlights stuck to your kneecaps, or your kneecaps were headlights. And if your legs are perfectly parallel, the beams made by those headlights are parallel also. If you have excessive pronation and internal rotation of the femurs, the 2 beams will cross, because when your femurs internally rotate, it means that the beams point towards each other. They start to point towards each other, so the beams will cross. We want them to slightly point away from each other, slightly. And how you achieve that is by focusing on inside ankle bone high and driving through the fifth metatarsal as a pivot point, which really just means feel the fifth metatarsal in your shoe. So drive the pinky toe into the bottom of the shoe a little bit. That will help you dome the arch, and your kneecap will naturally follow where it should be. That's the only cue you really need to focus on, is feeling that fifth metatarsal during harder pedaling. Make sense? Those are my cues for seated cycling. That's how to go pedal a bike in the saddle. Now we're going to talk about standing cycling. And for standing cycling, chapter 2, I have 6 cues. Let's see if I make it through all of them. I think I will. Ooh, my shoes are covered in mud. Like a lot of mud. You guys get a photo of this too. Ha-ha. Kaboom. Look at that. Stupendous. The number 1 commandment for standing cycling, and this is the reason I think so many people get a bit confused in standing cycling, head over foot. By the way, spoiler, some of these cues are going to be the same, and some will be slightly different. So standing cycling is definitely different. I'm scraping mud off the shoe, although it's probably premature because I'm not to the pavement yet. So a lot of times I see people standing on a bike and it looks like they just don't quite know what they're doing. Zach Morris, my colleague at TMF Coaching, coined this phrase, and I think it sums it up brilliantly. It looks like people are riding, they're working a Stairmaster in the gym, right? Or a stepper machine rather than riding a bike. And what's the difference? When you're on a step machine, it's kind of robotic and the body's not really moving too well. And maybe there's some head over foot. When you do that on the bike and the bike stays vertical, then your body moves over the bike. We do not want this. This is incorrect. We want the bike to rock under the body, even with head over foot. We want the bike to rock under the body. This is critical. Absolutely critical. It's the best way to drive power into the pedals, for sure. And it's also the best way to pedal efficiently out of the saddle. Couple guys trail running there. Straight up the goat path. Well done. And so we're talking about head over foot out of the saddle. And you can see this clearly in a lot of photos of racers doing their thing, full gas. And I will show you some of these photos and draw tidy lines and diagrams so that you can see what I'm talking about. But the concept is really simple. When you're out of the saddle, if you're pushing down with the right leg, your head should be either moving over to the right side, and then at the bottom of the power phase, it should be over the foot. And when you do that, you're putting your weight into that right leg. This is why standing up out of the saddle can be so efficient, because your weight is driving the pedal down. You're using body weight to drive the bike forward. In fact, you can actually not recover per se, but you can very easily make quite a bit of power standing up out of the saddle if you have good basic core control and good overall body conditioning by simply letting your weight fall on the pedals out of the saddle by using head over foot. But if you try to keep the bike vertical, which is a misconception some entry-level riders have, in my experience, they try to keep the bike vertical, then the body moves over the bike and you're not using your body weight to drive as nearly as efficient. So just as when we're running and walking and we want our head over foot, and just as when we're driving in the saddle with a lot of power, we want head over the foot, it's the same concept out of the saddle. We want to drive with head over foot. This is crucial. So that is principle number 1. Now, in order to drive effectively head over foot, you're going to have some tension in all 3 joints, the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And you're going to want those joints to be relatively fixed during at least part of the power phase. So if a joint is moving, that means not all the power is getting through the joint, right? That means the muscle's working. So, or the muscle is not holding tension to convey force, we'll say, or transmit force. Ooh, I'm editing my document here because my phone is wet. Stay with me, phone. Side note, in addition to enabling head over foot when we're out of the saddle, we want to consider that bar width plays a role in the relationship of how effective you can be with head over foot. And I have noticed that this trend, this ridiculous trend towards super narrow handlebars, has actually ruined some riders' ability to ride effectively or as effectively with head over foot. If the bars are too narrow, you can't rock the bike enough and you can't get your head over your foot. So this is a case where we can see that people are sacrificing out of the saddle power for aerodynamics. Now, maybe that's your gig and that's what you want to do, and you think you're super cool in aero because you're turning your road bike into a time trial bike. I'm going to refrain from comments on the new Giro helmet at the moment because anyway. But we have to understand that the critical moments in a bike race, the moments that cause race winning separations, are most of the time out of the saddle. And so if you're giving up your standing power to gain aerodynamics, that could be advisable. It all depends on your strategy. Look, if you're trying to win Milan-San Remo and you still think you can achieve separation over the climb, but then you're going to win it because you stay away in the last 2K on the flats, okay, then maybe it was worth it, but only if it doesn't cut off your nose to spite your face. If you attack over the last climb and you make 100 watts less because you can't get head over foot on the bike, which really comes down to using the fascial system of the entire body. That's what we're talking about, is load sharing over multiple muscle groups, right? So when you're pushing down on that pedal, you're driving with the arm, the lats, the posterior oblique chain, the glutes, the quads, the hamstrings, and the calves. It's pretty much every muscle in the body going into the power phase on that side. And in order to do that, we have to have the right leverage points. And one of the critical leverage points is the width of the bar, because it's about the distance from the center of the stem to the center of the hood. And so when we have that relationship is correct relative to the width of the shoulders of the person and the other levers in the system, which comes down to the width of the hips, probably the length of the femur, and the length of the foot, and the pedal separation distance, otherwise known as Q factor in the US, then when those levers are all in correct relationship, then you get a magnificent moment of power. But when we hold ourselves to an aerodynamic ideal and try to sculpt things too much, it becomes artificial, right? Or you sacrifice performance. There's a point when the spear can become, you're too focused on sharpening the sword. We have to come back to hammering it. That'll get into another analogy that I will use about training in a future episode. The episode will be on forging the blade, hammering the steel, and then sharpening the blade, right? Forging the sword, that is. Okay. So that's point number one, is head over foot. And narrow bars destroy head over foot. Also, bars that are too wide will destroy it as well, because you don't have the right leverage angle on the bar. The wider the bars, the more you have to rock the bike. But there's a point when the bars are too narrow and you just can't rock it enough. Last point on this. Guess what ruins head over foot? I'll give you 3 seconds to think about it, knowing me. No, it's not leaf blowers, but you're close. Riding a trainer. So when people get on a trainer that doesn't move, it's not on a platform and it doesn't rock, it's not a rocker plate, you're not on rollers, and the bike doesn't move, and they stand up all the time, they learn to move their bike, to move their body over the bike, because the bike can't rock, of course. So this ruins the concept of head over foot. People lose how to do it. So this is one of the reasons why people get outdoors and they look like they're on a Stairmaster when they're trying to go up a hill on a bike. And it's just like the discussion about the difference between fine art and porn. If you're not looking for head over foot, you can still see it. You can tell. You're like, something's not right there. I'm not sure what it is. I can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it. Rule number 2 about standing up out of the saddle. Push early in the power phase. Right? Same concept as before. Push early in the power phase when the crank is vertical. And I would add to that, inside ankle bone high is even more crucial. Drive with the outside of the foot, the 5th metatarsal. Drive with the outside of the foot early in the power phase. Just make that your focus and you'll do a world of good. Third concept. Oh, wait, I forgot one really important thing. Do not pull up on the backside of the stroke except in a sprint or a really, really sharp acceleration like an attack. That is when you are allowed to pull up on the pedal. That is full gas. Go for it. Otherwise, don't pull up on the pedals. When you're trying to use your body weight to ride out of the saddle, and do less pushing and let more body weight do the work and rock the bike underneath you and keep your ankle, knee, and hip relatively locked so the weight falls on the pedal. You need to rock the bike at the appropriate way and rhythm and moment and amount so that can happen. And you don't want to pull up then. Just focus on letting the weight fall. Third point, you are pulling up on the ipsilateral bar. So contralateral, contra meaning opposite. Ipsi must mean same. I don't know for sure, but equal probably will say is what ipsi means. I think that's right in Latin. It's a cool word though. Say it. Say it with me. Ipsilateral. It's fun to say. So Francisco, we pull up on the ipsilateral bar. What does that mean? That means if you're pushing down with the left quad and the bike is starting to rock to the right, you are pulling up with the left hand on the bar. And the harder you go, the more you pull. Now, some people get this backwards. They pull with the contralateral arm. This is incorrect. There's also a few weirdos out there who think you should only push on the bars with your hands and you should not pull. This is also completely incorrect. Watch a slow motion of any modern sprinter and watch how they pull on the bars. You pull with the ipsilateral hand every time. You also pull with the ipsilateral hand when you attack on a climb. You pull with the ipsilateral hand when you're in the resting position, we'll call it, out of the saddle. That is letting your weight fall and do the work. A lot of people miss this point. They don't quite get the relationship of the hand pulling on the bar, which is really the arm. And same cue applies. We want to keep that shoulder gently down and back to activate the lat. And that connection between the same-sided hip and arm is what makes a bike go forward effectively and efficiently. Now, as a side note, this is also one of the things that screws up gait pattern and movement. And this is why I think it's so important for people to go for hikes and walks and runs in the off season, because walking and running are the most fundamental movement patterns of the human body, and they are essential for daily life. Don't not underestimate them, please. Their contribution to our well-being and health is non-trivial. And walking and running are contralateral movement patterns. That is, when you step forward with the right leg, the left arm comes forward. And when you step forward with the left leg, the right arm comes forward. When you run, you swing the contralateral arm. Cycling out of the saddle works the ipsilateral arm. And it's the same thing when you're in the saddle. You can even pull on the bars. When you're going really hard on a steep climb, you can pull on the bars. You can pull with both arms in the saddle, a technique which I actually prefer on steep climbs, especially mountain biking. But really got to pull with the same-sided arm, and this disrupts this pattern. It cross-wires it or unwires it or layers a superficial movement program on top of a primal one. And this can cause problems. This is why sometimes when you command a cyclist to march, right? Marching in its archetypal form is contralateral. And often when you just pop quiz somebody who's a cyclist to march, they'll start marching ipsilaterally. That's a sign they've been doing too much of their sport and not enough of something else. Okay, now we're doing the mud removal. There's quite a bit here. Ugh, gross. I brought back some terroir. So, maybe I'll add it to my wine later. Fourth point, hips and shoulders are relatively quiet. The bike moves under the body. When this doesn't happen, it's like you're on a Stairmaster. So, point 1 is head over foot, which is intimately related to point 4, which is the hips and the shoulders are quiet. Hips, shoulders, and head are really in one place. And the bike moves under you, like a metronome under you. This is something to practice. And if you can't figure out what you're doing when you're riding, 2 things to consider. 1, look down at your bike, and on every pedal stroke, you should see if the top tube is always obfuscating the down tube, then you're not rocking the bike. So on every pedal stroke, on every power phase at the bottom, you should see the top tube. For example, when you pedal with the right foot at the bottom of the stroke, you should see the top tube to the left of the down tube and the bottom bracket. And then on the opposite side, when you pedal with the right leg at the bottom of the power phase, you should see the top tube to the right of the bottom bracket and the down tube. Make sense? You should see your water bottle appearing and disappearing on every pedal stroke. When you're doing this, don't ride into something because you're staring down at your bottom bracket trying to figure out what you're doing. But the other way is just have your buddy, your riding friend, take an iPhone video of you. Have him film you from behind when you're out of the saddle. Then you can see how much head over foot you have. You can do it in normal speed or slow-mo. And you can stop it at the bottom of the stroke and just draw a vertical line through the center of your head and see what's below it. You'll be able to figure it out pretty quick. To a certain degree, we're all visual learners, but then we have to go put it into practice. We have to feel what we're doing and connect it with the visual cues. So it might be a multi-step process. Have patience. Keep learning about yourself. Primary commandment of being an athlete, know thyself. This is first. Fifth point about riding out of the saddle. Your weight will be more forward over the bottom bracket. So remember, if you're riding and you keep your weight back, if you come out of the saddle but your butt is over the saddle, you're not going to be able to rock the bike under you because your saddle will hit you in the thighs. So your weight has to come forward. Now, if you're on a steep climb, that happens somewhat naturally because your weight will come forward to be over the bottom bracket somewhat. The steeper the climb, probably the more forward your weight will be. Your elbows may be bent or not, depending on what mode you're in. If you're going harder, you're going to bend your elbows more because you're going to pull more on that ipsilateral handlebar. If you're more in weight dropping mode, that is dropping your weight over the power phase to drive the bike, and conservation mode, then your arms might be a little more towards straight. So that depends on the gradient, the intensity of the ride, and probably the gear and the torque as well, right? Notice that when you're out of the saddle and you're pedaling more quickly, it's much harder to get a lot of bike rock. So the faster you pedal out of the saddle, the less bike rock you can have and the less head over foot you can have. It's possible to have some head over foot, but with a really high cadence out of the saddle, that becomes more challenging. So there's a relationship there with the cadence as well. And then the sixth point, well, I guess I already covered this actually. I got ahead of myself. But the sixth point is that standing can be used for increased power or recovery. And when we're using it for recovery, what we mean is we're using our weight to drive the pedal to fall. Right? But you can also use it to go faster. And I get this misconception quite a bit. Sometimes people are a little confused about riding out of the saddle. They think it's a bad thing because they've read that it's inefficient. That was probably really loud because it's raining now. So the roads are wet. So people are confused about riding out of the saddle. They think it's inefficient. Well, we could get into the technical definition of efficiency, exercise efficiency, but that's not really relevant. What you need to know is this. Will your heart rate go higher when you get out of the saddle? Also a misconception. Look, critical moments of bike races or competitive riding happen out of the saddle. So if let's give you a hypothetical. Maybe this will allow me to explain it a little more clearly. Sometimes we have to use standing power, even at great expense, to get the job done. It's that simple. It's like a turbo button. And a turbo button will use a lot more fuel. Is it less efficient than a gas engine? Yeah, probably. But do you need it to stay with the group over a climb? So here's my example. Let's say you're in a rolling event, a road race or a fondo or whatever, and you come to a small hill and the race is already blown to smithereens, and you're in this little group and you're, we'll say, one of the less strong riders in this particular group. And you start going up the climb and you're barely hanging on the back. You're moving towards the back of that group. And then you see the summit and you sort of calculate, okay, I'm barely going to make it over the top of this climb with this group. So then if you're aware, you don't just focus grimly on the road ahead. You also look behind you to see how many riders are behind me. I can feel the leaders of this group starting to slip away a little bit. I can tell by their pace that it's going to be really challenging for me to make it to the top of this roller. So you look behind you and there's only one person behind you in the group. Okay, so that means you don't have a big margin of error to play with. You can't sag anymore. And then you take another look behind you to see if there are any other groups behind you. And there's no one. You can see the road for quite a ways. I'm just making up a hypothetical scenario to illustrate the point. And you can't see anyone for a long time. Ooh, all right. Well, that means I should probably stay on this group, because if I get dropped over the top of this climb, I'm going to have to ride by myself for a long time. And let's also add that there's a long valley after this climb. So you're highly motivated to stay with these riders. You got 300 meters to go. Well, at that point, it makes sense to cash in a chip and stand up to produce more power over the top, right? To do whatever you've got to do to stay with this group so that you don't have to ride by yourself through that valley, through that long valley. And then you can sit on and recover for a bit. And then once you're recovered, maybe you take some pulls in the group, but you're going to bank on using this energy right now to stay with this group. And a rider who's got a good internal sense of timing and a good internal sense of gauge of their own ability to dig deep can normally stay with a group like that, even if they have to go a couple of percentage points deeper than everyone else in that group, because they're riding with riders that are just a little bit better than they are in this scenario. And that's okay. A clever rider can do that. And then you recover and they start yelling at you or giving you dirty looks, and you explain to them, hey man, I'm barely hanging on. I'll come through when I can. And then the honorable thing to do is start pulling after a bit once you're recovered. Right? And that's all fair. But in that moment, it makes a lot of sense to use your standing ability to climb over the top of that roller. Now, if you're thinking, well, I don't want to go that deep, or that's inefficient, or I don't want my heart rate to go that high, or I don't want to be uneconomical for a few minutes, or whatever term's going through your head, and you choose to not stand up over the hill, and you save you make 65 watts less for this 3-minute climb, and you get dumped by 3 lengths over the top, and then you never catch on, and then you ride by yourself. That was the world's loudest Toyota. You ride by yourself for the next 30K. That seems like a poor tactical choice from my perspective. So these are the times when we want to use our standing effort to its advantage. We want to recognize that standing cycling is what gives us the ability to really hit the turbo at the right moment. It's what separates the race winner from second place in most cases, right? So standing cycling is something that a lot of riders don't seem to use much, but everyone should have it as a weapon in their arsenal. And it should be well practiced and rehearsed. So if you don't stand a lot, I invite you to go out on your rides and practice just standing up, sitting down, standing up, sitting down. A great drill to do is simply pick a long climb and set a particular tempo, whatever that may be. Might be, you don't need to go super hard. It doesn't have to be a threshold ride. Could just be a low end tempo as an example. Stand up for 30 seconds and shift 1 or 2 gears. And by that, I mean 1 or 2 gears bigger. Smaller cog equals a bigger gear. Ride in that bigger gear for 30 seconds, then sit down, shift back to the gear you were in. Ride for 30 seconds. Repeat that 10, 12 times. Then give yourself a rest. Do 1 to 3 sets of that. There's a workout suggestion you might find helpful. And that'll help refine your standing technique. And when you're standing, think about our cues. So here's our synopsis. If I can find my notes. The first cue is head over foot. This rocks the bike. The second is push early in the power phase. Emphasize feeling the space under the 5th metatarsal. The third is pull up on the ipsilateral or same-sided handlebar as the power foot. When you do this, gently feel the lats engaging. Feel the shoulders down and back, retracted and depressed. It's 3:42 p.m. as I come back to my house, and this is child drop-off and pickup hour at the school down the street from us. Literally, my entire street becomes a parking lot and complete chaos. That's why we get all this traffic noise. Sorry for the background congestion here. Fourth point, the hips are quiet and the bike moves under the body. Fifth point, the weight is forward over the bottom bracket. By the way, the same cue also applies here, axial extension of the spine. We definitely want a long extended spine while standing out of the saddle. You don't want to tuck your pelvis under and go into that hollow hold position. Not everyone agrees with me on this. Some people would encourage you to use a hollow hold. I do not think that's a constructive way to ride. I don't think it's the best way for most people to ride most of the time. And then the last point is simply that standing up can be used to increase power. And this is a weapon we have to learn to use at the right moment. I hope my thoughts on how to pedal a bike 2.0 were helpful for you. If you have questions or comments or I confuse the crap out of you, hit me a note on Instagram and I will try to get your questions answered. And if you ask me a good question, then I will put it on the next pod. Pronto. I will also include, as I mentioned, some examples of head over foot. And I'll try to find some ideal examples of Tommy Voeckler also, so you can see what to do and what not to do. Thank you for listening, Padawan. And for allowing me to play the piano at you while I walked on this rainy, slushy day. I'm going to go inside now and take a shower because I'm cold. Pedal consciously, think critically, and act intuitively. Thanks for listening. Hello there, Cycling in Alignment listeners. I'd like to take a brief moment to speak to you about the podcast. As of this recording, I'm well over 125 episodes in, and this has been a multi-year project. And I'd like to say that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have this podcast. And I mean, I suppose just about anybody could have a podcast now. But what I have is an opportunity to really educate people about the things that I've learned and have amazing discussions with so many guests on my pod. And I've got so many more episodes planned in the future. That said, this podcast is a challenge for me. It's a challenge to put it on, to find the time, and it requires financial investment. I've got to pay for an editor. I've got to pay for equipment. I'm paying for software, paying for all the things you have to pay for when you put a podcast out into the world. And I have had financial supporters in the past. Enduro Bearings, namely, has been a great supporter. I've had other supporters as well. But moving forward, I'd like to offer a model in which my audience can show their appreciation directly. After a great amount of consideration and consternation on this topic, I've come to have a model in my mind. The model's really simple. If you have appreciation for the Cycling in Alignment podcast, if you have listened to my episodes and felt that it really has enriched your life, helped you, educated you, perhaps made you think about things from a different perspective, maybe you agreed with me on everything, maybe you agreed with me on just about nothing, but you listened anyway. I can't imagine that's the case, but I suppose it's possible. Maybe you agree with about 89% of what I say, and the other 11% of the time you think I am batshit crazy. In any case, if you would like to express your appreciation for the time, effort, and money that I put into this project, I would be grateful if you would go to my website, colbypierce.com, and click on the podcast page and offer some appreciation in the form of a financial contribution. This will help me offset the cost of this podcast. I may have other financial contributors in the future. This isn't a closed model by any means, but I do need to find a way to monetize this podcast. I've considered platforms like Patreon and others, but they seem convoluted and complicated. I don't really want to go to a paywall system. I really want to just offer content and teach, educate, discuss, philosophize, have great dialogue with the guests that I'm honored to have on my show. And to do this in the simplest way possible, I just need to push record, that is, and then you push play and get it out there. That's always been one of my methods of operation, is keep it as simple as possible and just produce the content. I don't have a goal of growing an audience. My goal is to educate people. And if I do that well, then my audience will grow as a side effect of that. So another way to offer your appreciation is to share my podcast with other people, to write reviews for me, do all the things, click the stars and make the comments. That helps because we live in a world of algorithmic preferential treatment. But if you want to move the dial for me, then please go to my website. That's colbypierce.com. click on the page titled Podcast, and there you will see some options to make a contribution that demonstrates your appreciation for what I've done. And for that, I will be grateful. There'll be a few different levels to this page, and the highest level will get you some goodies in as a thank you, including some woolly Rafa t-shirts printed with my Pierce Coaching and Fitting logo. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you in advance for anything you can do to help me spread the word. If you aren't in a position to contribute financially or don't want to, again, you can help by simply forwarding my podcast, sharing it with other people, sharing it with your friends, tell people about it on rides, spread the word, and even just send me a message and let me know if I've moved the dial for you. Send me a message and let me know if you have pertinent questions. Also, at the highest level of the podcast contribution page, you will have the opportunity to submit a personalized question for detailed analysis on an episode or a private consultation, if that's what you prefer. So that's going to be something I can offer you in return for your financial contribution to my podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I'm so grateful for my audience. I appreciate you and the opportunity you've given me. Epilogue. I want to share a few brief thoughts about the inception of cycling and alignment. The purpose of this podcast is for me to get 3.5 decades of hard-fought lessons out of my skull. Some of them through my own research and reading. Some of them I've been taught through mentors and colleagues, other riders, other racers. A lot of it, a massive amount of it, was simply trial and error through my own stubborn methods. And that has amassed a certain amount of experience and knowledge, understanding. And while I think I'm reasonably smart and I know quite a bit of stuff, I want to make it clear that the opinions that I share on this podcast are belief systems built on what I've experienced to this point. And that some of those opinions are pretty strong, but they are also loosely held. That is to say that if I learn more about a topic and have a greater level of clarity or understanding, then my old belief systems will be abandoned and I will now operate under that newfound knowledge. So I'm not here to tell people all the things that I know. I'm here to explain what I've learned to this point. And there's a big difference. Also, that is the intent when I discuss things on the pod with guests, is to learn from them and have a discourse. Because if we can't have a discourse as adults, then we've lost one of the basic tenets of modern society. Even if we disagree, we ought to be able to, in most cases, shake hands and walk away. Because after all, this is sport we're talking about, and while sport is training for life, it's nothing to get too upset over. The purpose of the podcast is to help me help other people, and specifically to help them actualize their highest potential by illuminating a path that enables alignment with their truth, their intent, and their coherence. That's really the end goal. So I'm grateful for your listening. My intent is also not, to be clear, to gain an audience or become popular or gain social status in any way. I don't care about that stuff. That said, if you feel an episode that you have heard will help someone you know, please share it with them. That helps us reach the end goal, which is to help more people. Thank you for listening. I'm grateful for your time and attention.